The first time my husband told my son, "You're not family," he didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He said it the way someone corrects a spelling mistake. It was his father's 70th birthday, and the Collins mansion was glowing like something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers, white-gloved servers, portraits of serious men with sharp noses and sharper eyes lining the walls. Generations of legacy staring down at us. Liam stood beside me in his navy blazer, clutching the small leather-bound journal he had picked out himself. "For Grandpa Richard," he had whispered proudly before we left the house. Derek looked down at him, jaw tight, smile thin. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. Liam blinked. "Dad." The room shifted. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned. Then Derek said it clearly, calmly, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "You're not family." I felt the words hit before I understood them. Before I could react, Derek gripped Liam's arm, firm but controlled, and steered him toward the French doors leading to the terrace. Liam stumbled once trying to keep up. The journal slipped from his hand and landed near the cake table. "Derek," I snapped. He didn't look at me. He pushed the door open, guided Liam outside into the cool night air, stepped back inside, and shut the glass doors with deliberate precision. The lock clicked. Liam's small hand pressed against the glass almost immediately. "Don't interfere," Derek said coldly without meeting my eyes. He didn't know I was already walking toward that door. The music faltered. Someone coughed. A fork clinked against porcelain too loudly. For a moment, no one moved. Not his mother, standing stiffly beside the fireplace. Not his father at the head of the room, hands clasped behind his back. Not the cousins who had laughed with Liam 15 minutes earlier. Through the glass, I could see my son's breath fogging faintly in the night air. His shoulders were squared the way he did when he was trying not to cry. I turned to Derek. "What do you mean he's not family?" He adjusted his cufflinks. "Hannah, don't make this bigger than it needs to be." "Bigger." My voice trembled despite my effort to steady it. "You just locked a 9-year-old outside." A murmur rippled through the room. One of his aunts leaned toward another and whispered, "Not quietly enough. He doesn't carry the Collins name." My mother-in-law approached me with a tight smile. "This was bound to happen," she said under her breath. "You should have thought more carefully before bringing him tonight." Bringing him, as if my son were an accessory. "It's his grandfather's birthday," I said. She glanced toward the study where several board members were gathered. "There are legal matters in motion. Sensitive ones. Legal matters." My heart dropped into my stomach. Behind me, Derek raised his voice slightly. Enough for the investors and senior partners to hear. "This family has traditions. Legacy matters. Bloodline matters. Bloodline." The word tasted metallic. I reached for the door handle and unlocked it. The click sounded louder than the music. The cool air rushed in as I stepped onto the terrace. Liam looked up at me, eyes wide but dry. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. The question split something open inside me. "No," I said immediately, kneeling in front of him. "You did nothing wrong." Behind us, Derek's voice came from the doorway. "You're making a scene." I stood, placing myself between him and my son. "You already did." Liam bent to pick up the journal he had dropped earlier. The corner was bent now. He smoothed it carefully with his thumb. Derek lowered his voice. "There are discussions happening about the will, about inheritance structure. The board needs clarity." "Clarity about what?" I demanded. "About heirs," he said. "About who represents this family going forward." Liam went very still beside me. 2 years ago, on our wedding night in Charleston, Derek had raised a glass and said, "Liam is my son." Later, in private, he had promised to finalize the adoption papers as soon as things settled at the company. The papers had been drafted. They had never been signed. Now I understood why. Inside, servers began cutting the cake as if nothing had happened. The room resumed its polite hum. But the air felt different, charged, divided. I took Liam's hand and walked back inside. If Derek expected us to disappear quietly, he had miscalculated. His father watched us carefully as we crossed the room. On a mahogany side table near the study, I noticed a thick leather folder embossed with the Collins crest. It hadn't been there earlier. Derek followed a few steps behind, tension visible in his shoulders. "We'll talk about this later," he muttered. "Oh, we will," I replied. Liam sat beside me at one of the side tables, silent now, studying the portraits on the wall. I leaned down and whispered, "You belong anywhere I stand. Do you hear me?" He nodded, but his jaw was clenched. Across the room, Derek checked his phone and exchanged a look with his father. It wasn't embarrassment I saw. It was urgency. As candles were lit and applause filled the mansion, I realized something chilling. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This was a step in a plan. And for the first time since marrying into the Collins family, I understood that they weren't just questioning my son's place in their legacy. They were preparing to erase it. I didn't sleep that night. The mansion was quiet by midnight. But it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that follows a storm no one wants to acknowledge. Derek came to bed hours later, smelling faintly of bourbon and expensive cologne, and slid under the covers without touching me. He fell asleep quickly. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of the lock clicking shut. The next morning, Liam was already dressed when I came downstairs. He was sitting at the long kitchen island, eating toast carefully, as if making crumbs would be another offense. "Morning, Mom," he said, too bright. "Morning, baby." Derek stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, controlled. "Yes," he said. "It has to be finalized before the quarter closes. We can't risk confusion." Finalized. My stomach tightened. He noticed me watching and turned slightly away, lowering his voice further. When he hung up, I said, "We need to talk." He sighed like I had asked him to reschedule a dentist appointment. "Hannah, not in front of Liam. Then let's step into the study." He hesitated, then nodded. Inside the study, surrounded by leather-bound books and framed awards, he closed the door. "You embarrassed me last night," he said immediately. "I embarrassed you." I stared at him. "You told a 9-year-old he wasn't family." He rubbed his temples. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" "This isn't about Liam personally," he said. "It's about structure, governance. The board needs clarity before we move forward." "Move forward with what?" "With succession planning." There it was again. "Derek," I said slowly, "you promised to adopt him." He looked away. "The timing hasn't been right." 2 years isn't right." "It's complicated." "No," I said. "It's deliberate." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand how this works. My father is revising the will. Shares are being restructured. Voting power is tied to blood descendants." "Blood." "If we have a biological child," he continued casually, "this entire issue becomes irrelevant." The words hit like ice water. "If we have..." I stopped. I can't." He didn't respond. Last year, after my surgery, he had held my hand and told me we already had everything we needed. I had believed him. Now he stood in front of me speaking about hypothetical biological heirs as if we were discussing weather forecasts. "This is about legacy," he said. "About protecting the Collins name." "From what?" "My son. It's not personal." "Then why did you humiliate him in front of 40 people? He exhaled sharply. "Because bringing him into that environment right now sends the wrong message." "What message?" "That there's ambiguity." Ambiguity. My son had become a legal gray area. Later that afternoon, I found my mother-in-law in the kitchen directing staff. She gave me a thin smile. "I hope you've calmed down," she said. "I'm trying to understand," I replied. "What exactly is being revised?" She adjusted a vase of white roses. "The attorneys advised clarity in the will. It avoids future disputes." "Disputes about what?" "About heirs." The word felt rehearsed. "How long has this been in discussion?" I asked. She paused just a second too long. These things take time. Time. That meant this wasn't new. It wasn't a reaction to last night. It was preparation. On the drive home later that day, Liam sat unusually quiet in the back seat. "Mom," he said finally. "Yes. If I change my last name to Collins, would that help?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "No," I said gently. "You don't need to change anything." He stared out the window. "I heard Dad talking to Grandpa. He said once the vote passes, it's done." "What vote?" He shrugged. "I don't know." They were in the study. That night, while Derek was at the office, I went into his home study and opened his desk drawer. Inside was a printed agenda for an upcoming shareholder meeting. Item 3 read, Lineage Qualification Clause. My heart pounded. Clipped to the back was a draft document with handwritten edits in Derek's neat, precise script. Phrases circled. Margins annotated. Blood descendant requirement. Retroactive application. Effective immediately upon approval. A yellow sticky note was attached to the front. Before Q4. No delays. My pulse roared in my ears. This wasn't theoretical. It was scheduled. Public humiliation at the party had been the narrative setup. The board vote would be the legal execution. Adoption papers never filed. Delayed. Suspended in limbo, not because he forgot, because keeping Liam unofficial made him removable. I sank into the leather chair and stared at the page. Every promise Derek had made replayed in my mind. Liam is my son. We'll file soon. Trust me. I had trusted him. Now I understood the pattern. He hadn't snapped at the mansion. He had established precedent. If the board approved the clause, if the will aligned with it, if a biological heir entered the picture, Liam would disappear from the legacy overnight. Not emotionally. Legally. And once something is written into corporate bylaws and estate documents, it doesn't matter how many birthday candles you once blew out together. It becomes official. I closed the folder carefully and slid it back into place. This wasn't about an argument anymore. It was about strategy. And if they were rewriting who counted as family behind closed doors, I needed to find out exactly what version of the future they had already signed my son out of. Claire didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds after she finished reading the draft. We were sitting in her corner office in uptown Charlotte, the skyline stretching behind her like a reminder that power always hides in plain sight. I had placed the shareholder agenda, the annotated lineage clause, and the sticky note marked before Q4 neatly on her desk. She leaned back slowly. "This isn't standard," she said at last. My throat felt dry. "In what way?" "In the way that it's precise. Targeted. Retroactive." She tapped the page with her pen. "See this language? All prior informal acknowledgments of beneficiary intent shall be superseded upon amendment approval." I felt my stomach drop. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said evenly, "if your son was ever informally referenced as a potential beneficiary, this clause erases it." "Erases? So he was included before?" I asked. "Possibly," she said. "At least in discussion." My heart pounded. "If this passes," she continued, "without formal adoption, Liam has no standing, no claim, no vote, no inheritance pathway. He becomes legally irrelevant to succession." Irrelevant. I stared at the words blood descendant requirement printed in bold across the top of the draft. "This isn't about tidying up documents," Claire said quietly. "This is about narrowing eligibility before something changes." "Changes how?" She studied me carefully. "Is there anything else going on?" I hesitated, then showed her the photo I had taken of Derek's calendar reminder. "Private trust formation." Claire pulled her laptop closer and began typing. "Corporate registry searches. Public filings. Trust registrations." Her expression shifted. "There's a trust," she said slowly. "Filed 2 months ago under Collins Family Holdings." My pulse roared in my ears. "For who?" She turned the screen toward me. "Beneficiary. Future direct heir of Derek Collins. No name. No birth date. Just a placeholder." The room went very still. "Are you aware of any pregnancy?" she asked carefully. I didn't answer immediately. Last year, after my surgery, the doctor had told me gently that another pregnancy was unlikely. Derek had squeezed my hand and said, "We don't need more. We're complete." Now there was a trust waiting for someone not yet born. It was fast-tracked, Claire added. Expedited registration. Someone expected it to be needed soon. I felt something inside me harden. "Check adoption filings," she said. "If he ever initiated formal proceedings, there will be a petition number." She searched court records while I stared at the skyline. Nothing. "No petition filed," she confirmed. "No formal intent recorded. Drafts, maybe, but no submission." He told me he was waiting for the right time. I said, "He was preserving flexibility," she replied. "Flexibility to remove him." She scrolled further through corporate documents. "There's another layer," she said. "What now?" "Last year's liquidity crisis." My head snapped up. "What about it?" "The company secured a substantial line of credit." "Yes, I know." She glanced at me. "You pledged collateral." I nodded slowly. "From my family's portfolio. It was temporary." She turned the screen toward me again. "Your personal guarantee is still active." I blinked. "That's impossible. Derek said it would roll off once expansion stabilized." "It hasn't," she said. "It's tied to current share structure and governance compliance." Governance compliance. If structural amendments materially alter beneficiary dynamics or voting distribution, she continued, the guarantor may request review. "That's me," I whispered. Claire met my eyes. "Yes." For a moment, the room felt like it tilted. Derek had framed my collateral as supportive, protective, a gesture of unity. But it also meant I wasn't just a spouse. I was leverage. "Let me guess," I said quietly. The trust registration and the vendor contract approval happened around the same time. She nodded. "Within the same week." "Elena Morales," I said. Claire didn't ask how I knew the name. Her firm's development contract was accelerated. Claire confirmed. "Personally authorized by Derek." The pieces aligned too neatly. Public humiliation to establish narrative. Lineage clause drafted for vote. Adoption never filed. Trust created for unnamed heir. Vendor contract fast-tracked for the pregnant partner. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. "Is there someone else?" Claire asked gently. I thought about the ultrasound notification I had seen flash across Derek's phone screen. Appointment confirmed. Thursday. Ultrasound suite. "Yes," I said. She nodded once. Business-like now. If infidelity intersects with corporate decision-making and undisclosed conflicts, that changes everything. How? It introduces fiduciary breach risk. And breach triggers review? Review meant delay. Delay meant space. Space meant protection. I exhaled slowly. For the first time since the night at the mansion, I didn't feel blindsided. I felt informed. "Don't confront him yet," Claire advised. "Let him believe you're still reacting emotionally. People reveal more when they think they're ahead." I gathered the papers. Hand steady now. When I walked back into my house that evening, Derek was at the kitchen island reviewing emails like nothing had shifted. He looked up and smiled. "Long day." "Yes," I said. He leaned over and kissed my cheek. "We'll sort everything out soon." Soon. His phone lit up on the counter. Ultrasound appointment confirmed. 12 weeks? I didn't look at him. They weren't just trying to rewrite my son out of the future. They were already drafting someone else into it. I didn't confront him about the ultrasound. Instead, I called Claire the next morning and asked for a recommendation. Within 48 hours, a discreet investigator confirmed what I already suspected. Derek had been seen entering a private OB/GYN clinic across town with Elena Morales. He stayed for over an hour. He left with his hand resting low on her back. 12 weeks. The investigator's report was clinical. Dates, times, photographs taken from a distance. No emotion attached. I stared at the images until they stopped looking like my husband and started looking like evidence. Claire dug deeper into Elena's background. Marketing executive. Ambitious. Her firm had secured a major development contract with Collins Holdings just weeks before the trust for a future direct heir was registered. The contract approval had been expedited. Personally authorized by Derek, the trust had been filed within the same week. It wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. If he acknowledges the pregnancy publicly before the lineage clause vote, Claire said carefully, the board will consider it a stabilizing factor. A direct heir. Investors like clarity. Clarity. I repeated. She nodded. Especially after last year's liquidity scare. Last year's liquidity scare. The same crisis that led me to pledge part of my family's portfolio as collateral for the company's emergency credit line. I want to review the prenup, she said. We sat across from each other. Pages spread between us. Line by line. Paragraph by paragraph. Halfway through, she stopped. There's an amendment filed 3 months ago. I frowned. That's impossible. It was submitted for registration, she clarified. But it's incomplete. Incomplete how? Your signature is missing. I leaned forward. The amendment attempted to redefine my role in corporate voting matters in the event of conflict of interest, specifically regarding succession-related disputes. Conflict of interest. Meaning Liam. He tried to reduce your influence quietly, Claire said. Without disclosure. A cold understanding slid into place. Derek hadn't just delayed adoption. He had been systematically limiting my leverage. At home, he acted as if nothing had changed. He discussed expansion plans over dinner, talked about long-term stability, mentioned future growth as if the words were harmless. One night, he said casually, the company deserves clarity. The future baby will simplify a lot of things. Future baby. Liam's fork froze halfway to his mouth. I watched my son swallow hard. Later, in his room, he asked me in a small voice, is Dad getting a new kid? I knelt in front of him. Yes, I said honestly. He nodded slowly. Will I still be here? The question wasn't about custody. It was about existence. You are not replaceable, I told him. But even as I said it, I understood what Derek was trying to do. He wasn't replacing a child emotionally. He was replacing him structurally. The next day, I requested a private meeting with Mr. Randall, the company's CFO. He had worked under Derek's father for 3 decades. Steady, quiet, observant. We met in his office with the blinds half drawn. You've been busy, he said mildly. I imagine so have you. He didn't deny it. The board believes a biological heir reassures certain investors, he admitted, especially given the expansion plans. Investors are being told something, I said. He gave me a long look. There's an assumption that succession clarity is imminent. Imminent. They're planning to move the vote sooner than scheduled, he added quietly. How soon? Within days. My pulse quickened. You should know, he said carefully. Your personal guarantee on the credit line remains a significant factor in current financing. I was told it would roll off. It hasn't. Claire had been right. If governance changes create instability. Mr. Randall continued. Ratings agencies may reassess exposure. Exposure. That was leverage. That night, I finally confronted Derek in our bedroom. I didn't mention Elena's name. Are you planning to replace my son? I asked. He didn't deny the pregnancy. He didn't deny the trust. He didn't deny the timeline. You can't expect my father to pass everything down to a child who isn't blood, he said flatly. Blood. The same word he had used at the mansion. I asked if you intended to adopt him. I said. Silence. That silence was louder than any confession. This isn't personal, he insisted. It's business. You made my child a business risk, I said. He shook his head. You're being dramatic. I almost laughed. Dramatic. I had pledged my assets to save his company. I had defended him at every board dinner. I had stood beside him in public and in private. And now my son was a liability to be managed. After he fell asleep, I walked into the kitchen and stared out at the dark backyard. My phone buzzed. A text from Claire. Emergency board session scheduled. 3 days. 3 days. They were accelerating everything. Derek believed he was moving pieces across a board I didn't understand. He believed I was reacting emotionally. He was wrong. If he wanted to turn my son into a line item on a balance sheet, I was about to show him exactly how expensive erasing family could become. The boardroom overlooked the Charlotte skyline like it owned it. Floor-to-ceiling glass. Polished walnut table. Leather chairs arranged with military precision. Collins Holdings etched discreetly into the frosted interior panels. Derek stood near the head of the table, composed in a charcoal suit, reviewing his notes as if he were about to present quarterly earnings instead of redefine a child's existence. His father sat at the center seat, hands folded. The other board members shuffled printed packets labeled Lineage Qualification Amendment. My name was not listed in the primary voting order. They hadn't expected me to speak. Derek cleared his throat. As you're all aware, he began smoothly, long-term investor confidence depends on structural clarity. The proposed amendment ensures our succession framework remains biologically anchored and eliminates ambiguity moving forward. Biologically anchored. He didn't say Liam's name. He didn't have to. This positions Collins Holdings for stability, he continued, especially as we prepare for upcoming developments. Upcoming developments. He was controlling the narrative before the announcement of the pregnancy. Several board members nodded. One leaned forward. And this removes any confusion about heirs. It does, Derek replied. I raised my hand. The room stilled. I'd like the floor, I said evenly. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. As both spouse and financial guarantor, I added. That word shifted the air. His father gestured. Go ahead, Hannah. I stood. Before this board votes on excluding a child from this family, I began calmly. I believe full disclosure is required. A ripple moved across the table. This isn't about emotion. Derek interjected. It's about governance. Exactly. I said, governance. I placed a slim folder on the table and opened it. Last year, when Collins Holdings faced a liquidity crisis, a secondary guarantor secured the emergency credit facility. I let the silence settle. That guarantor was me. Several heads turned. Derek's expression hardened. The guarantee remains active. I continued. It is tied to current share structure and governance compliance. Any material change in beneficiary dynamics may trigger review. Mr. Randall cleared his throat quietly. That is accurate. A murmur spread across the room. Derek leaned forward. This is irrelevant to the amendment. Is it? I asked. Because structural instability tends to concern investors. His father's eyes shifted between us. And since we're discussing transparency, I said, sliding another document forward. Perhaps we should also address the trust registered 2 months ago. Derek's composure cracked for half a second. The room stilled. Future direct heir of Derek Collins. I read aloud from the filing. A board member frowned. What trust? Derek straightened. That's a private matter. Not if it intersects with succession planning, I replied. I met his eyes. Would you like to inform the board about the pregnancy now? The word hung in the air. Silence pressed against the glass walls. His father turned slowly toward him. Is this true? He asked. Derek inhaled. Yes. But it's personal. Not when you're drafting lineage amendments in parallel, I said calmly. I slid a printed timeline across the table. Contract approval for Elena Morales' development firm. Trust registration. Amendment drafting. All within the same week. The connection was undeniable. A senior board member spoke. Was this relationship disclosed? Derek's silence answered for him. If personal relationships influenced contract acceleration, Mr. Randall said carefully, disclosure would have been required. Derek's voice sharpened. You're turning a private issue into corporate sabotage. I didn't raise my voice. No. You turned a pregnancy into a governance strategy. Gasps rippled around the table. Claire, seated behind me, quietly slid forward the unsigned prenup amendment Derek had attempted to file 3 months earlier. An attempt was made to limit my voting influence without my acknowledgement, I said. Several board members leaned in to examine it. This suggests concealment, one muttered. Derek looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. You're declaring war, he said under his breath. I'm demanding transparency, I replied. His father spoke slowly. Given the circumstances, I propose we postpone the vote pending full review. Relief flickered across a few faces. A hand rose at the far end of the table. Seconded. Derek's jaw clenched. The chairman called for suspension of the amendment. The vote was tabled. Just like that. No shouting. No dramatic exit. Just procedure. The room emptied gradually. Conversations hushed and urgent. Derek approached me near the door. You just jeopardized everything, he hissed. You jeopardized it the moment you locked my son outside, I said evenly. He stared at me, anger simmering beneath control. This isn't over. I know, I replied. As I stepped into the elevator, Mr. Randall caught my eye. They'll try again, he said quietly. Let them, I answered. For the first time since that night at the mansion, Derek wasn't the one controlling the room. And he knew it. Derek came home that night looking like a man who had swallowed glass. He set his briefcase down harder than necessary and loosened his tie without speaking. The house felt different now, less like a shared space and more like contested territory. You blindsided me, he said finally. I asked for transparency, I replied. You humiliated me in front of my father. In front of the board, I held his gaze. You humiliated a child in front of 40 guests. He paced once across the kitchen, jaw tight. You don't understand what you've jeopardized. Then explain it. The board doesn't like instability, he snapped. They don't like scandal. They don't like internal conflict. They don't like undisclosed conflicts of interest either. He stopped walking. The next morning, his father requested a private meeting at the mansion. I almost declined. Almost. But this wasn't about comfort anymore. He received me in the smaller sitting room, not the formal study. No board members. No chandeliers. Just 2 armchairs and a pot of untouched coffee. You've escalated things, he said without preamble. So has your son? He studied me for a long moment. Are you planning to destroy this company out of revenge? The word hung between us. I'm planning to protect my child, I said calmly. He leaned back slowly. Legacy is complicated. Integrity shouldn't be. He exhaled. I was not aware of the pregnancy timeline. But you were aware of the amendment. He didn't deny it. We believed clarification was necessary, he said. Investors prefer biological certainty. Biological certainty, I repeated, at the cost of erasing a boy who has called you grandpa for 2 years. His jaw tightened. Derek moved faster than I expected, he admitted quietly. Faster, meaning there had been coordination. Is the board aware of the morality clause tied to my guarantee? I asked. His eyes flickered. Yes, and they are concerned. Good. That afternoon, Claire called. The board is nervous, she said. Rumors are circulating. Analysts are asking questions. About what? Conflict of interest. Governance risk. Stability. Stability. The same word Derek had used to justify exclusion. There's more, she added. A competing firm has quietly inquired whether Collins Holdings is vulnerable to acquisition discussions. Acquisition. The idea alone would terrify Derek's father. That evening, Derek confronted me again. He didn't pretend this time. Elena is 12 weeks pregnant, he said flatly. I didn't react. You already knew, he muttered. Yes. He ran a hand through his hair. This wasn't planned. The trust was... He didn't answer. The amendment was... Silence. You preemptively erased my son before anyone even knew about the baby, I said. It's not about erasing... He insisted. It's about ensuring a direct heir. Ensuring your position. I corrected. He stepped closer. You can't expect my father to hand everything to a child who isn't blood. Blood. The word again. And you couldn't expect me to stand quietly while you rewrote his place in this family. He exhaled sharply. You're blowing this up. No, I said evenly. You are. The next morning, Claire drafted the formal notice, a review request under the morality clause of my financial guarantee. It didn't collapse the credit line, but it froze aggressive restructuring until investigation concluded. Within hours, Derek's father called an emergency executive session. Emergency. Control was slipping. Unexpectedly, Elena appeared at the corporate office that afternoon demanding clarity. She had not known about the timing of the lineage clause vote. She had not known about the shareholder agenda. She believed Derek was separated in everything but paperwork. He had misled both households. Now she was furious. If her contract had been used as leverage to secure succession optics, she threatened to consult counsel. The fractures multiplied. The board informed Derek that no amendment would proceed until conflict disclosures were completed and governance irregularities reviewed. He accused me of poisoning the family against him. You did that yourself, I said. Later that night, Liam sat at the kitchen table drawing quietly. Am I in trouble at Dad's work? He asked. No, I said immediately. He looked down at his paper. If Dad has another baby, will I disappear? The question landed heavier than any legal clause. I knelt beside him. You are not a problem to be solved, I said. You are not temporary. You are not replaceable. He nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt lingering. After he went to bed, my phone buzzed. Claire again. Preliminary audit shows vendor favoritism tied to Elena's firm. She wrote, documentation is strong. Vendor favoritism meant corporate breach. Breach meant consequences. Derek stood in the hallway watching me read the message. You're tearing this family apart, he said quietly. No, I replied. I'm exposing what it really is. He looked tired now, cornered. He thought blood would secure his legacy. He forgot something. Power doesn't belong exclusively to lineage. Sometimes it belongs to the person he underestimated. Standing very still across the table, Claire called me before sunrise. They found internal emails, she said without greeting. Derek personally pushed Elena's contract through compliance before formal review. He used language about strategic alignment before structural announcements. Structural announcements. The phrase felt almost clinical now. By mid-morning, an emergency board hearing had been scheduled. Not a vote. A review? I filed for legal separation before I walked into that building. Marital misconduct. Financial concealment. Governance manipulation. The filing triggered automatic freezes on certain asset transfers and required full disclosure of extramarital financial entanglements. Derek would no longer control the timing. When I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere had changed. Less polished confidence. More tension. Derek looked exhausted, but still defiant. This is personal, he said immediately when the session began. It should not be driving corporate policy? Then you shouldn't have tied personal actions to corporate restructuring, I replied. Claire distributed copies of the unsigned prenup amendment Derek had attempted to file. I was never informed of this, she said clearly. Nor did Mrs. Collins sign it. It sought to limit her governance influence in succession matters. A board member frowned. That suggests concealment. Derek shifted in his seat. It was a draft. A draft filed for registration, Claire corrected calmly. The room fell silent. Then Elena spoke. She had requested to attend. She sat at the far end of the table, pale but composed. I was told Derek was effectively separated, she said. I was not informed about any lineage amendment vote or that my pregnancy was being discussed in relation to succession. Her voice didn't shake. I did not consent to my firm's contract being accelerated for personal optics. A few board members exchanged sharp looks. Derek stood abruptly. This is spiraling. It spiraled when you withheld material information. One of the senior directors replied. I leaned forward slightly. Did you intend to finalize the lineage amendment before publicly acknowledging this child? I asked Derek. He didn't answer. His father did. That would constitute bad faith governance. The phrase hung heavy in the air. Bad faith. Claire formally invoked review under the morality clause of my financial guarantee. If fiduciary breach is established, she said evenly, the guarantor reserves the right to reassess continued support. Support. Not sabotage. Not revenge. Support. Mr. Randall cleared his throat. Analysts have already requested clarification on the conflict of interest disclosures. Derek's composure cracked. You're weaponizing a pregnancy. He snapped at me. No, I said quietly. You did. Silence. A board member raised a hand. I propose temporary suspension of Derek Collins's voting privileges pending investigation. The words felt surreal. Suspension. Seconded. His father stood slowly. As chairman, he said, voice steady but heavy. Legacy must be rooted in integrity. Concealment undermines investor trust. Effective immediately. Executive authority will transition to an interim structure led by Mr. Randall while this matter is reviewed. The air shifted. Derek stared at him. You're siding with her, he demanded. I'm siding with the company, his father replied. Formal removal. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just recorded. When the session adjourned, Derek followed me into the hallway. You've destroyed everything, he said through clenched teeth. No, I answered. I stopped you from destroying my son's place in it. You leveraged the company against me. You leveraged a pregnancy first. He flinched at that. I would have taken care of you, he said, almost pleading now. You would have been secure. Secure. Like a dependent. Like a silent beneficiary. I don't need to be taken care of, I said. I need my child to be respected. Claire joined me by the elevator. We move quickly now, she said. Divorce filing. Custody protections. Governance reform proposal to prevent lineage-only amendments from being introduced retroactively. Yes, I said. This wasn't just about winning. It was about preventing it from happening again. That night, Derek packed a suitcase. He moved into a temporary apartment downtown. The mansion felt less oppressive without him there. Liam noticed the absence immediately. Is Dad mad? He asked softly. Sometimes people get angry when they lose control. I told him. He considered that. Am I in trouble? No, I said firmly. You did nothing wrong. My phone vibrated. Claire. Preliminary board vote supports permanent removal pending investigation. Permanent. The word settled over me like a quiet sunrise. I stepped outside onto the terrace where it had all begun. The same glass doors. The same night air. Only this time, no one was locked out. The man who once shut my son outside a room full of legacy was now the one standing outside the room where decisions were made. And this time, no one was opening the door for him. 6 months later, the house we moved into didn't have chandeliers. It had sunlight. Real, ordinary sunlight that poured through wide kitchen windows every morning and landed on the scuffed hardwood floors Liam insisted we keep instead of replacing. The divorce finalized without spectacle. No dramatic courtroom scenes. No public statements beyond a brief corporate filing announcing leadership transition at Collins Holdings. Derek officially resigned as CEO 2 months after the investigation concluded. The internal audit confirmed undisclosed conflict of interest tied to Elena's firm and improper acceleration of contract approvals. Governance breach. Fiduciary risk. The board framed it carefully. To preserve long-term stability and investor trust. The same stability Derek had once used to justify excluding my son. The lineage-only amendment was permanently withdrawn from consideration. The language was removed from draft archives entirely. It would never reach another agenda. Mr. Randall became interim CEO. Quiet. Methodical. Ethical. Collins Holdings survived. Derek's authority did not. He retained minority shares but lost control. Voting privileges restricted pending further restructuring. The board implemented stricter disclosure requirements and conflict reviews. Legacy. It turned out, could not survive deception. Elena relocated out of state before her third trimester. The development contract was reassigned through competitive review. Whatever relationship she and Derek maintained was no longer a corporate matter. The baby would be Derek's responsibility, not a strategy. At home, things were simpler. Smaller house, smaller dining table, fewer portraits staring down at us. Liam started therapy 3 weeks after we moved. At first, he refused to talk. Then one afternoon, he asked me something that still echoes in my chest. If I'm not blood, am I temporary? I knelt in front of him. You are not a placeholder, I said. You are not an audition. You are not a maybe. He looked at me carefully. But Dad said, I know what he said. He swallowed. If he has another baby, do I disappear? I shook my head. You don't disappear because someone else exists. Family isn't a competition. He thought about that. A few days later, he asked if he should change his last name. Would that make it easier? He said. Names don't create belonging. I told him. People do. He kept his name. Not because it matched mine, but because it belonged to him. 2 months after the divorce finalized, Derek's father asked to see Liam. I almost said no, but I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe, not the mansion. He looked older, smaller somehow. I failed to intervene sooner, he said directly. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't defend tradition. He handed me a folder. Inside was documentation for an independent education trust established in Liam's name. Not tied to Colin's bloodline language. Not contingent on adoption. Not framed as charity. It was acknowledgement. I should have spoken up the night of the party, he said quietly. I didn't. I held his gaze. No, I agreed. You didn't. Liam accepted his handshake cautiously. It wasn't reconciliation. It was accountability. That mattered more. Derek and I speak only when necessary now. Custody schedules. Logistics. Short. Neutral exchanges. The last time we stood in the same room, he said quietly. You didn't have to destroy me, I answered calmly. You destroyed your own credibility. I protected my child. He didn't argue. There's something almost strange about the absence of chaos. No shouting. No dramatic revenge speech. Just consequences. The night Derek told my son, "You're not family," he believed he was defining reality. He believed blood was power. He believed lineage could be edited like a document. He didn't understand something critical. Family is not a clause. It's not a vote. It's not an amendment filed before Q4. It's who stands beside you when a door is slammed shut. It's who unlocks it. Sometimes I think back to that moment on the terrace. The glass doors. The cold night air. Liam's small hand against the window. I remember the click of the lock. At the time, I thought that sound marked humiliation. Now I realize it marked exposure. It revealed what the Collins legacy truly was willing to protect. And what I was willing to fight for. Liam rides his bike in our driveway now every evening after dinner. He races the length of it and shouts, "Mom, am I fast? You were never behind." I tell him. He laughs. Wind in his hair. Sunlight catching in his eyes. There are no portraits here. No silent juries. Just space to breathe. If you've ever been told you don't belong, if someone tried to redefine your place in your own family, if you've ever had to sit quietly, gather your strength, and protect your child from people who believed blood mattered more than love, I want you to know something. You are not wrong for setting boundaries. You are not cruel for demanding integrity. And you are not required to shrink yourself so someone else can feel powerful. Sometimes the real show begins when the door locks. And sometimes it begins when you decide to open it anyway. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from. Have you ever faced favoritism, inheritance drama, or a moment when someone tried to erase you from a legacy? I read every comment. And if stories about family, hidden power, and turning the tables speak to you, stay with this channel. Because there are more conversations like this, about dignity, about justice, about building something stronger than the systems that tried to exclude you. My husband once said my son wasn't family. He was wrong. And I made sure the world knew it.